250 countries in the world in size. We're the sixth and world most innovation countries by the OECD ranking. So we were in a very, very good position. But then October 7th happened and it changed everything. And I'll try to explain why I'm saying that. This is, you remember the grass from the picture before? This is how it looked a couple of weeks ago, year after. This is Kibbutz Nir Oz. Still, you see the burned houses, the burned kibbutzim. It's not just another war that we're having in Israel. And in numbers, if you follow it, it's over 1,200 murdered, about 5,000 people wounded, 251 hostages on that day. These are the numbers of October 7th day. And hundreds of thousands of people being called up to reserves in one day. One day. That means that if you're living in Israel, if you have family in Israel, the probability of you not being a part in some way of this horrible day is very low. Either you know someone who, who experienced the horrors of October 7th, or your family member, or spouse, or son, or brother is being drafted to the IDF on that specific day. And until today from Gaza, we had about 13,000 missiles fired. On the first day, 3,000 rockets on one day, which is, just try to imagine the amount of alarms, the amount or the feeling inside of Israel in that day. And that, of course, reflected on the economy very fast. But before I get to that, let's try to look at the Israeli economy from 12 months after that horrible day. And I think there's a couple of things you'll maybe find surprising. And I'll try to do it in a way of questions and answers. I hope it will be interesting. It's the first time we're trying it, but we'll try, and I hope it will work. So first of all, the first question that I'm trying to address here is that what happened to investors? Like, investors invested in Israeli economy, and then they had October 7th. So if they take a look a year now, a year has passed, what happened to their money? What happened to their investments? And I think you'll find it very interesting that from October 7th until now, the stock market in Israel rose. We're talking about a year of war, a year of multi front war. 27%, the Tel Aviv 35 stock index rose in this year of war. I think it's an amazing data. And of course, the shekel, which is the Israeli currency, is now even stronger than it was on October 6th. So how can we explain that, right? That what happened to the economy? Is war that good to the economy that it jumped by 27, 25%, the stock market? And I'll try to show you why it happened. And I think it has a lot to do with the Israeli nature and the basis of Israeli economy. So first of all, what's the impact of the war on our GDP? And if you take a look at earlier crises that previous crisis we have faced, if you take a look at the Lebanon war in 2006 or the operations that came after that, even if you take a look at the worst event in the history of the Israeli economy, which is COVID, you see it in 2020, with which we experienced very, very negative growth. You see what happens in the year after, or the month after that crisis. So if you take a look at COVID, you see a huge jump in GDP. We finished 2021 Israeli economy with almost 10% growth. In 2022, 6.5% growth. That's after COVID, which we experienced minus 1 2% growth, let's say. And the same thing happened in the beginning of this war. The last quarter of 2023, which was actually when October 7th happened, we experienced very, very low growth. I'll explain why in a second, but after this horrible day that took hundreds of thousands of people from their works into the army, what actually happened is the economy stopped. For the first month, the economy stopped. Because try to imagine if you're at home and you have kids, let's say, and then one of the parents, either the mother or the father, or sometimes both, are called into reserves, and there's alarms outside because missiles are fired at your city, at your home, then one of the parents has to stay at home with the kids, and one of the parents is not at work, is at the IDF. The school also closed because of these missiles, thousands of missiles raining down on Israel. So the first reaction of the war was actually the economy stopped. And it took a couple of weeks to come back. And that's what we see in the last quarter of 2023. We see a huge drop in GDP. But then even in this first quarter of 2024, we already saw a jump of about 17% growth. So we're not yet, you see it in the graph here in the right side, that we're not yet in the place that we were before October 7, but we're getting that. We're 99% of it. And I hope that in the end of this year we'll be at least at the place that we were before October 7th started. But also the projections of the Israeli economy, because of this nature of bouncing back, this is IMF projections which were just released last week on the Israeli economy and the US economy. We see the projection that Israel's GDP growth will be lower than expected. We were supposed to be in 2024 about 3%, so we lost a lot, but we're still a positive growth, real positive growth, which is, for me, it's amazing after this year of war, still growing. The economy is still growing, and the projections for 2025 and 2029 until 2029 are even higher than most economies, even higher than the US projections and even higher than the OECD projections. So the Israeli economy is very strong, and we'll talk about why in a second. But there was an impact of this war on the economy and on expenses, on our ability to raise debt. So the first impact was costs. This war has cost a lot of money, a lot. We're talking about 250 billion shekels over the years 2023 to 2025. That's the projection. And not only it costs a lot of money, the things that we spend money on are very unique in this war that we have never had before. Like, if you see here, you see the defense budget, of course, it's the biggest part of expenditure, but civilian expenditure, about 40 billion shekel, that's about 4 times the most costly operation that we have experienced. That only the civilian expenditure part, which was housing people that evacuated communities from the north or the south into hotels in the central of Israel, that alone was more than any cost we have ever experienced in the last couple of decades on war. And another thing that we're seeing is interest costs coming up. I think the latest data is even not 7 billion, it's 10 billion more. We are now in need to spend 10 billion shekels more than we did before, just because we have to spend more on debt to pay interest cost on our debt. That happens because of two reasons. First of all, the debt is coming up. We're using more debt. And the second thing is that our rating is coming down because of the war. And that makes us pay higher interest. But I want to tell you something about the fundamentals of the Israeli ability to raise debt and why why this war isn't actually affecting that ability. So first of all, when you have debt, you can either get like the government needs monies and it goes outside to the markets to raise that money. So it could go to the domestic market, Israel, and have their debt in shekels, the currency, the Israeli currency. That's what we do with 83% of our debt. We raise it in Israel in shekels, but 17% of our debt, we go out to the world and say, if you whoever wants to invest in Israel, we're willing to pay these kinds of interests if you want to invest in Israel. And we have 17% of our debt, we call it foreign debt. And 17% is not high compared to other countries. It's about $54 billion. And if we take this $54 billion in foreign debt, what you want to see when you invest in something, you want to see the ability to pay you back your investment, right? So the ability to pay back foreign debt is actually measured by the amount of dollars that Israel has, not shekels, because shekels we can print, but dollars we can't print. So how many dollars do we have, the country of Israel? And that splits into two. First of all, the surplus in the foreign account. We have a yearly surplus in the foreign account. The foreign account is the measurement between investment of Israelis, let's say, let's simplify it, Israelis outside of Israel and investments of foreign citizens in Israel. So we invest more in countries than countries invest in us. So we have a surplus. We have more dollars, about $26 billion a year. That's the surplus. But also we have foreign currency reserves. The central bank creates this huge reserves of dollars in Israel. This is one of the biggest amounts of reserves in the world, $220 billion. And when you take a look at the debt, 54 billion, and you take a look at the reserves, 220 billion or the 26 billion of yearly surplus, then you understand what actually the rating companies that actually downgraded us really understand. And while downgrading us, they're saying, well, there's no real chance that the government in Israel can't raise debt. And the answer to the question why is this? Because we have huge reserves of foreign currency, and there's no chance we're not going to pay back our debt. And we talked about about the current account surplus. That also the IMF released a projection on that a week ago, and they're projecting that our high surplus will keep on going and at least until 2029. So that also gives a very, very strong message to the market that we're in a very good place. But the war has affected things, of course, and affected one of the things that it affected the most is the labor market, as I said, people that can't go into work because they need to go to army reserves and things like that. So what actually changed in these 12 months? So you can see here on the graph that talks about the absence in the job market. You see, in October 2023, we actually had a lot of absentees, a lot. That's because what I talked about, the need for one of the parents at least to stay at home, and the other one being drafted into reserves. But as we see the months progress until August, the numbers go down. People came back to work very, very fast. We're now seeing an increase in that because of the war in the north, but it's not too significant. And another thing has happened to our unemployment rate. We are now also in an all-time low of 2.6% in unemployment. And that, of course, is a very good number and a very comforting number while we are at war. I think that's one of the strengths of the Israeli economy. Some of that is because the role that high tech plays in Israel and the ability to work from far. Some of it is the consumption going up, but again, the job market is in a very, very good place, even after 12 months of war. There's one sector that actually experienced a very big shock, and that's the construction sector. And the shock that it experienced mostly happened because it was relied on Palestinian workers. And after October 7th, one of the first things that happened is preventing Palestinian workers to come into Israel because of security risks and security concerns. So that sector was highly affected by the start of this war and the labor changes. But we already see that even though the construction sector lost 12% of its labor, when we start measuring the actual results of this sector in the last year, we're seeing a decrease, but a very small one, like 4%, and not 12% that you would expect when you lose so much of your labor force. So what's actually our ability to raise debt? Or what affects our ability to raise debt in the future? Well, we talked about expenditure coming up, but it's not just coming up this year because of the war. There's two changes in the Israeli budget that were gonna stay with us at least for the medium term. And that's defense costs that probably are gonna go up significantly after this war because of a change of preference in the Israeli sorry, the Israeli uh, decision-making process, because we now see things differently than we saw on October 6th. And financial expenses. As I said, if you have a debt of $50, then you pay interest on $50. But when your debt rises and it's $100, you pay more interest. And that's another thing that we'll have to deal with coming up this budget. I don't know if you know that, but on this Thursday, uh, the Israeli budget for 2025 is supposed to be approved. And we talked about it before that a way to measure the ability of a country to raise debt is to measure her debt to her GDP, to what it actually produces. The Israeli number for that now in 2024, after a year of war, it's about 67%. About 67%. If we take a look at the average OECD countries, we see that average OECD is 110% debt to GDP. So, and you see this arrow here and the right side, that's actually the room that we don't want to, but we could grow in the debt, in the Israeli debt, and still be lower than average OECD countries. I don't know if you know the numbers of the US. The US is over 100% debt to GDP ratio. And that's without talking about the foreign exchange that we have talked about and the current account surplus. So we are very, very strong financially, very strong. And that's part of the reason why every time we issue out debt, we have demand, let's say 4 times, 4 times for that amount. And of course, that's why when you see people investing in Israel, they're certain that they'll see their money back. And even if you would have invested in Israel a year ago, you'll be up 30% on your money. So we said high tech is a very big part of Israeli growth. So how did this war affect the high tech industry in Israel? So we were concerned about that. We really were, because our high tech sector is very dependent on foreign money, foreign investments. But we had some very, very, let's say, positive data that we have just got in this last quarter that shows that Israel's high-tech sector in this quarter was number 3 in the world in investments. And this year, a year of war, just only after the Silicon Valley and New York, Israel was the third most that had the high-tech hub that had most investments, more than Boston's hub or Los Angeles, Paris, San Diego, London. I think that says a lot about the strength of the Israeli high-tech sector, and that teaches us why the Israeli economy is still growing, because we do get this investments and the economy is continuing. We say when we talk about high-tech exports, you know, it's called services exports. So we're actually exporting services. And for that, you need, we laugh about it and say that you need only a computer and a sandwich. And I think in wartime, having this ability to still export high-tech services is very, very meaningful and a very big driver of our economy. But it's not only the effect of the actual war on the economy. This war has also been an economic war against Israel, and I'll explain. First of all, I don't know how many of you know, one of it happened months into the war, 1 month or 2 months into the war, the Houthim, Iranian terror organization in Yemen, wanted to prevent Israel from getting goods from the world, and then blocked, by using terror methods, blocked the Bab el-Mandeb corridor, which leads to the Suez Canal. And we see here the drop between, you see here in November 2023, the actual drop in volume of trade through the Bab el-Mandeb corridor and the Suez Canal, which is huge. It's about 70%. I think the drop is between 7 ships a day to about 20, 70 to about 20. That's a huge drop. And we're talking about a corridor which is a home of about 10% of global trade, not trade to Israel, global trade. And all of that was in order to prevent the Israeli economy of getting goods through sea. I think one of the so if we take a look how it actually affected the economy, of course it affected global economy because it was the pathway for about 10% of global trade. But actually the amount of trade that Israel does through the Red Sea is very, very low. And we do have other ports in the Mediterranean Sea. So the actual effect of this on the Israeli economy, it wasn't a negative effect or a not significant negative effect. I think that the country that suffered the most from this is, of course, Egypt, which lost a lot of its trade volume that went into the Suez Canal because of this terror attacks. The other thing to see is uh, countries announcing boycotts against Israel. We see it with Turkey. Turkey announced boycott against Israel. But we need to understand that Turkey was a country that exported to Israel more than it imported from Israel. So that means from the beginning that they're going to lose more by not trading with Israel than Israel itself. And there were some concerns in some areas that we were more relied on Turkish goods, mostly in construction also. But we see that if we take a look at what actually happened, we found substitutions for those imports very, very fast and in very similar costs to what was the Turkish costs. So I think we're now not trading with Turkey, but the actual effect of that on the Israeli economy was very, very low. Another thing to understand is that you would have think that the Arab countries that uh, we're in close relations with after the Abraham Accords will probably go down. Trade will go down, and what we actually see is that trade with Abraham Accords countries have only came up and only gotten bigger. We see it in 2023 with the UAE, and The first half of 2024 is even higher, and Bahrain and Morocco trade is coming up, and the trend is very clear for that. And I think that's a very good thing to understand in this war. And I think another thing to understand is that in 2023, 50% of trade coming to Israel through the Jordan crossing, was from Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, and Bahrain. And that's compared to 30% a couple of years before, which again is a very, very positive trend. But it's not only that it's coming more from Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates, it's that trade has actually gone up in the past couple of years by hundreds of percents uh, in volume in this specific pathway. And war, there's of course the challenges, but there's the opportunity as well. We don't wish for it. It's not an objective for us, but it happens because in war there's a lot of innovation, a lot of industry, and I think we see it in the Israeli defense sector. We have a very powerful defense sector. 2023 was a record year of $13 billion. You see here some of the areas that we had exports in, if it's air defense systems, or if it's cyber, or or IT, a lot of different opportunities. But it's not only that, it's the collaboration between when you take the Israeli high-tech sector and then you send it into reserves in the IDF, you get a lot of new innovations. And we're already starting to see hundreds of collaboration between private tech, Israeli private tech companies, and defense agencies and defense companies. And I think that will create a huge boost to the Israeli economy, a huge boost. And it will affect globally, I'm sure. Also, I don't know how many of you know, in order not to lose uh, that many working hours in reserves, the army actually built this WeWork tents that it's creating in reserves units, and there the reserves can connect to internet and continue working in their companies. And with their clients overseas. And I think that's a very big change this war than what we had ever before. I'm sorry. Another thing that's happening, I don't know if you know that as well. One of the basic challenges in the Israeli economy is ultra-Orthodox community being a part of the economy. That's if we didn't have this war and we had this conversation about Israeli economy, that will probably be the biggest challenge that we have. And I think what we're starting to see, it's not there yet, it's not solved, but what we're starting to see is the ultra-Orthodox community starting to understand better the need for them to get better education in order for them to be more integrated in the workforce, at least. I'm not talking about the army, which it's better than it was before, but it's very far for where everybody would wish. Here, we're starting to see some kind of change in the education system of them being more open to learn other subjects that can improve their abilities to participate in the workforce when they get there. The last opportunity I think that I want to mention here, I don't know how many of you know about the IMEC project, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. It's a project that was announced in the G7 by President Biden about 2 years ago, but it's been in the works for several years now. It's a new corridor of goods connecting India on one side to Europe, and that's happening through the Middle East. You see here the countries that it's supposed to go through. And I think what's the and that's a very big opportunity for the Israeli economy. And as I said, we're starting to see even now, because the path, I can't point it out for you, but if you take a look at the gray area, which is the sea, and that path is blocked because of the Houthim. So even now, today, we're seeing more and more goods coming through this IMEC corridor, which is not yet built, but it's starting to work. And I think the implication of that on Israel is huge because if you take the actual corridor, what it does is lowering shipping costs of about between 2,000 and 8,000 per container, which is a lot. And it's supposed to create a significant trade flow or a boost of trade flow to Israel and the entire region, and of course, new opportunities and new business interactions with our friends in the region, countries that we have relationships with, and countries that we hope to have in the near future. Um, the last thing I'll talk about is something that we're working with our US partners. We said in the beginning, it was mentioned that we have a joint economic working group with the US administration. And I think I don't know how many of you know about US policies on economic relationships, on trade. We hear it now a lot with in the elections, with tariffs. I know it's a very big word that is now being thrown out everywhere. Who are you having your economic relationship with? So if we take a look at the Israeli market, if in 2016 only 29% of investments in Israel came from G7 countries, we see now this year or 2023, about 94% of investments are from G7 countries. And most of it, as you can see, is from the US. We finished 2023 with 75% of investments coming from US, which is a lot. And I think that agenda is not only for Israel. I know that this administration have been this is something that the National Security Advisor mentioned. I think it was a year ago, 2 years ago, about the strategy of trade for the U.S. administration. That it says that there are gonna be some industrial strategies at home, but it has to connect to our friends and that countries that work with us, not only for their sake, for their economies, but also for the American economy and the things that it can do to American economy being more in contact with Israeli technology, for example. And we see it starting to happen in the U.S. Policy. We saw it. I won't get into you if you want afterwards. What exactly is the DPA, the Defense Production Act, or the Inflation Reduction Act? What it does, but all these kinds of laws of new policies create new groups like reglobalization. It's organizing the world in a new way that brings friends closer and creates walls with countries of concern. We see it a lot with U.S. and China, for example, and we hear it about tariffs or about other trade constrictions. But there's these countries that get preferred treatment, and those the I think Secretary Yellen called it, the Treasury Secretary called it friendshoring, or there's a lot of words to it. And I think one of our challenges now in Israel, if you want to show the world that we're going to come strong from this war, not only uh, as we are now, I think the challenge is to add Israel to all these groups of countries or this reglobalization that the US is working on. So, in conclusion, I will just say that the Israeli economy in Israel is very strong, but we can be a lot stronger if we'll be more together and connect even more than we are now. And with that, I leave it to your questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Minister Hacker. We have several questions that everyone submitted early on. And I will read these. if anybody has additional questions, they can put them in the chat, and if we have time, we'll get to those. I'll start with the first question, which is, how do we contribute as students in another country to the economy of Israel? What are the lessons we can learn comparing Israel to the economies of other countries in similar situations, particularly Singapore and South Korea?
Okay, so I don't know what you're students of, but I can tell you that in every field, one of our biggest strengths as the Israeli economy is our connection to the US economy. So if you're learning medicine, then find time to go and see some hospitals or know some companies, medical companies in Israel, or most of them, just to say, are American companies established in Israel. If you're learning engineering, the same. I think the personal connection between you and Israel, the actual relationship between Israeli students and American students can make a very big difference. You and the Israeli students that you'll meet will probably find yourself later in your careers in significant places, in companies, and that ability to pick up a phone and call and know more about the Israeli economy and think about how you can cooperate with Israeli partners. I think that's very important, and I think that's what drives our economy. So I would urge you to either visit Israel, not only once. You can do that a couple of times throughout your careers, your lives, but also keep in touch. Keep in touch with Israeli companies, with Israeli friends, things that are interesting to you in some areas. Probably there are some interesting technologies in Israel that you can learn from, that you can try to connect to America. And I think that's, if you ask me what's the most important thing you can do, I think that's the thing. Uh, Come visit and improve your relationship with Israel.
That is a great response. All right, the second question, this is kind of a multifaceted question. What was Israel's GNP, which is the gross national product,
Mhm.
in 2023? And what was it versus the prior year up to October 7th? What is Israel's GNP in 2024 in the year to date? And what do you forecast for the year and years ahead? Where can we find Israel's economic statistics in that?
Okay. So first of all, if you need the statistics, I can provide it for you. Or we have, I know that you added in your chat, we have a weekly newsletter about Israeli economy that we update there also, also on the GDP, but also on other things. If it's interesting to you, it's very short, not something long, and we try to keep it very readable and simple. But on the question, so I'll talk about the changes. The Israel GDP is about $200 billion. It's about that amount. Uh, the changes to GDP is that what we saw is that in COVID, we'll take it from COVID. In COVID, we experienced one of the first time we experienced a year with negative growth. It was less than 2%. It's about 2% negative growth in 2020. But then in 2021, we came out of COVID, 9.6% growth. And the year after that, 6.8% growth. That's 2022. In 2023, the projections for the Israeli economy were about 3% growth, but we actually grew only by 2% because of that last quarter of October 7th. So we did finish 2023 in 2% growth, but we were supposed to finish 2023 higher in about 3% growth. And the projections for 2024 were about 3% growth, and we're gonna finish 2024 in about 0.7% growth. That's the area. The IMF projects Let me just go back to it that I went. The IMF projects about 3.5. I can tell you the Israeli Ministry of Finance projections, okay? The Ministry of Finance projections is that 2025 will grow by 4.2%. And I don't want you to think that it's like wishful thinking because let's say the central bank in Israel projects a little less than 4, and the IMF projects also something around 4%, 3 point, I don't remember what, but close to 4%. So that's the projections on 2025. I'm sorry, 2025. So 2025, we're gonna compensate for some of the loss in 2024. And the actual growth rate for the Israeli economy for the long run, it's about 3%, 3.5%, which is very high compared to other economies. So I hope I answered the questions, but if you need data on that, you can just be in contact with us and we'll give you whatever you need and we'll direct you to where you can see it in the Israeli website and the Central Statistic Bureau or the Ministry of Finance.
Great. And again, I pinned that that link for everybody to subscribe to the Econ Israel newsletter, so that you can have those economic statistics at your disposal every Friday. The next question is, how has the threat of sanctions affected the Israeli economy?
So I think it's not sanctions, it's more like boycott. And it created some changes. I think when it started with the Houthis in Yemen or the Turkey boycott, we we didn't really prepare for it in advance, but now we're looking more into who our trading partners are and how can we work with them. I don't think we're concerned about sanctions on the Israeli economy. That's not the concern. But what we do see is countries boycotting Israel. And I think we need to, part of it is showing the world that it's not an effective tool to use on Israel and it only hurts your economy. And the way to show that is either by growing like we are in our economy, but also, as I said in the last couple of slides, bringing our friends even closer and showing that the potential of growth with our actual friends, example, and our best friend, the US, will only be stronger and higher. And I think that will give the answer, the real answer to those countries thinking about hurting the Israeli economy by preventing trade with us. And I think that that's what we're working on, and that's our biggest focus.
All right, on the topic of trade, we have another question that's somewhat related. And this is a worst case scenario situation, but in the event of worst case scenario, what would a closed economy look like for Israel, and is that viable?
I don't think it's not something that we're thinking about even. I think in this day and age, it's not something that's relevant. Uh, we're way far from that. Look, as you saw, countries that trade with us I'm not talking only US or Western European countries. Even countries that boycott us want to buy our technology, our defense technology, our missile defense technology. It's not something that's relevant. Uh, I think Israel has a very big advantage, technological advantage that a lot of countries in the world need for their national security. Not want, need. And that's something that's not going to change. So it's not something that we're not even thinking close to that.
Great. All right, so I'll take the questions from the chat because some of these are repetitive that people have asked or you've already answered them. Um, We have a question here. I understand that purchases of government bonds add to the Israeli treasury, but how does a rising stock market help fund government activity?
So first of all, it's it's connected, but it's not highly connected. Look, most of Israeli economy is private sector. It's not the government sector. And we want to see the market rising because then people invest more in companies. And that's important to us. And that means that the government doesn't need to do it because the private sector is working. Government bonds, on the other hand, is money that's going into the government, of course. And that's the big difference. So even though like when market rises and profits go up, we see an increase in revenue, but I think the biggest effect there is the actual private sector working, not the revenue that we're gonna get from those profits as government. And so it's not directly connected, and it's mostly for the private sector. And that's the most important thing. It's even more important than government in this time because even though that security provides the conditions for a healthy economy provides the resources for security. So we have to keep those two working and working very well. And the stock market is one indicator that the private sector is working well.
All right, thank you. And so we have another question here. What has driven the extraordinary rise in the Israeli stock market since October 7th?
So first of all, I think a lot of people, a lot of smart people, I'm invested in the stock market because my pensions are invested in Israel, uh, but I think a lot of smart people is looking at the Israeli market and seeing the opportunity. As I said, after these kinds of events, the Israeli economy boosts. We have a boost. It's like holding a spring in your hand, and then so in the beginning it gets smaller, but then when you open your hand, it jumps out. And that's what happening. That's the experience we have with the Israeli economy. We had it after every war operation. We had it after COVID, and we're starting to see it now because it's a longer war. We can't see it like immediately, but it's we're starting to see it, and people see that as an opportunity. And the other thing is because we're a small economy and we're mostly an export economy, and if we'll say like high-tech export, the war didn't have a big effect on that. And even it had a positive effect because it created more innovation in healthcare, in drones, in a lot of areas, laser, a lot of areas that are now experiencing a very big investment boost because of the opportunity they have after this war coming into the market, coming into the civilian market. So there's a lot of reasons to believe in the Israeli economy and expect it to grow. And I think that's what we're seeing in the stock market. That combined with the financial stability that we talked about, that people really understand that there's no chance that Israel is going to run out of dollars, and and that with the opportunity, I think that what helps the stock market to rise, and it's very important for us. So I think that's our strength, the ability to continue growth and boost after these kinds of events.
Great, thank you. I'll ask the last question because I know we have several students who are studying economics. What advice would you give to students or anyone who are interested in economics or who are studying economics, and how can they get to a point of where you are? And what would you say to your student self in terms of rising up the economic ladder?
So that's a good question. First of all, I believe in combination between the private sector and the government sector. That's why I spent some time in government. I went to the private sector to work a little bit, and now I'm back in government. Probably after that, going back in the private sector. Um, so I believe you need to experience both. But for people like me that are really interesting in government economic policy, you have a big chance because Israel, it's only Israel economic policy. You have the world economic policy to deal with here in the US. And I think there's a lot of very interesting thing to do. And this is a very interesting time to be in that situations because if for many years we've been in the open economy, globalization kind of situation, we see now a very big, this is going to be an error that we're going to teach economic students about in the future, how it changes from globalization to reglobalization, or I don't know how to call it. This is happening now. We see it actually in this election with the tariff and things that were unbelievable just 10 years ago. And I think it's very interesting time. Uh, I actually started the lowest you can start in government with the Excel sheets and like whatever we need to do, and grew from there. But I don't know if that's the best way to go at it. But first of all, you need to have the drive for it, and we Israelis, we're not shy. Uh, we're doing we know what we want and we go and get it. And that's my suggestion to you, that understand what you want to do and just go and get it. Uh, and hope for the best.
That's a great answer. Thank you. So I want to thank you and your team for speaking to us. I again want to reiterate, and I'll actually share the QR code with everybody so that they can attach to that newsletter that you have. I want to make sure that people are able to access that. So here, I'll share it now. And you guys can scan that with your phones. Thank you for speaking to the students today. I know that they really benefited from this, and we'll be sharing this with the rest of the students who weren't able to make it today. So thank you. And
Thank you
Noah,
very much.
appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye bye.